I've recently had an intense experience with my mother, and it has left me reflecting on my family dynamic and my sense of belonging within it. To provide some context, I'm a 17-year-old girl living with my mother, who is 43, my stepfather, and my two step-siblings, Jackson, who is a year older than me, and Emma, who is 2 years younger. While we all live together and attend the same high school, we've never formed any real connection. My mother married my stepfather 3 years ago, but we've lived together for 6 years. Despite my hopes for a close-knit, blended family, reality didn't align with my expectations. My father passed away when I was very young. He and my mother were never married due to disapproval from his family, who found fault with my mother's reputation. Before his untimely death from leukemia at 27, my father made provisions for me, establishing a trust fund for my education. Though I barely remember him, his foresight ensured I wouldn't have to struggle financially for college. The fund, managed by his lawyer, will be under my full control when I turn 18. After my father's death, it was just my mother and me for a long time. When my stepfather entered the picture, I was 8. While I hoped our new living arrangement would bring me the family I always longed for, it didn't turn out that way. My stepfather and his kids were polite but distant, and despite my efforts to bond with them, they showed little interest. Over time, I stopped trying, accepting our dynamic as one of coexistence rather than connection. What stung the most was watching my mother thrive in this new family. My stepfather and step-siblings treated her as if she were a missing piece of their puzzle, fully welcoming her. That warmth, however, never extended to me. I don't think it was deliberate, but the energy was unmistakable. I was an outsider in my own home. Resentment began to build quietly as I grew older. My mother had found her place, her people, but I was left on the sidelines. The tension between my mother and me came to a head recently. With college approaching, I had been researching schools and preparing my applications. I wasn't worried about finances because of the fund my father had left for me. Then, my mother approached me with a startling request. She wanted me to share my college fund with my step-siblings. She explained that my stepfather hadn't saved enough for Jackson and Emma's education, and since Jackson was also about to start college, they needed help. Legally, my mother couldn't force me to share the fund, as my father's will had made it clear that the money was solely for my use. Still, the request caught me off guard. I understood her concern, but I didn't feel it was my responsibility to support Jackson and Emma. We weren't close, and despite living under the same roof, I didn't view them as family. The money my father left was a safety net for my future, a resource to help me not just with college but also as I transitioned into adulthood. I calmly told my mother that I didn't want to share the fund. I suggested that Jackson could take out student loans, just like countless others do. This answer didn't sit well with her. She accused me of being selfish, and I didn't deny it. I acknowledged that I was prioritizing myself and was okay with it because I didn't feel obligated to help my step-siblings. This honest admission seemed to trigger something in her. My mother's reaction was explosive. She began yelling, her voice rising with anger as she berated me for not considering Jackson and Emma family. It was as if my words had crossed an unspoken line, and she couldn't fathom how I could feel that way. But to me, it was simply the truth, a truth I'd been quietly carrying for years. This confrontation left me feeling isolated and misunderstood. For as long as I can remember, I've strived to fit into this family, to feel included and valued. Yet, when I finally stood up for myself and my future, I was met with hostility. It's hard to process, but I know I'm not wrong for wanting to protect the one thing my father left me. This moment has made it clear just how deeply our family's fractures run. It's painful, but it's also freeing in a way. I now understand that my sense of belonging doesn't hinge on their approval. I'm determined to focus on my education and future, even if it means doing so without their support. The double standards in my mother's behavior were truly astonishing. For 8 years, I had been treated like an outsider by the family she had chosen to build, and she either failed to notice or simply didn't care. Yet, when it came to me, I was expected to consider them family, respect them as such, and even sacrifice for them, all without ever receiving that same treatment in return. When the argument began, I tried to speak to her calmly and reasonably, hoping we could reach an understanding without descending into a shouting match. Unfortunately, she was already beyond reason, calling me ungrateful and selfish among other things. I sat quietly, allowing her to vent, and once she finished, I told her that yelling wouldn't change my mind. If anything, it would only push me further away and strengthen my resolve not to help. This seemed to surprise her, and for a moment, she calmed down. For a fleeting second, I believed we could have a rational conversation, one where I could explain my feelings. But I was naive to think my emotions mattered in that house. My happiness was secondary. What mattered most was the comfort and contentment of my mother, my stepfather, and their children. My mother soon delivered an ultimatum. I had 1 week to decide whether I would share the college fund or be forced to leave the house. I thought she was joking. The idea that my own mother could threaten to kick me out, simply for wanting to protect the inheritance my father had left for me, was absurd. But she wasn't joking. She made it clear that once I turned 18, she wouldn't even have a legal obligation to let me stay, and I would be out on my own. The sheer cruelty of her words stunned me. I couldn't believe that my mother, the woman who was supposed to love me unconditionally, could prioritize her new family over her own daughter. That moment was a turning point for me. I realized my mother didn't care about my well-being. Her loyalty lay firmly with her new family, and I was nothing more than an afterthought. It was clear that staying in that house was no longer an option, so I resolved to leave as soon as possible, no matter the cost. I confided in my closest friends, explaining everything that had happened and asking for their help. One of them mentioned a cousin who was also applying to the same colleges as me. This cousin planned to live independently in an apartment near campus, and my friend suggested I get in touch with her. When I did, we instantly clicked. She was kind, understanding, and excited about the idea of sharing an apartment if we ended up at the same college. With that part of my plan sorted, I turned my attention to finding a place to stay until college began. Fortunately, my friends came through for me again, offering to let me stay with them for a few months. It wasn't ideal, and it felt risky, but the thought of living with my mother and her family for even one more day was unbearable. The atmosphere at home had become toxic. My mother and her family treated me as though I was some sort of villain. They didn't confront me directly, but their behavior was cruel in its own subtle way. If I entered a room, everyone would fall silent and leave. They avoided eye contact, whispered behind my back, and acted as if my presence was a stain on their lives. It was humiliating. When my mother approached me again to ask if I had changed my mind, I stood firm. I told her I wouldn't give up the college fund and that I was planning to leave. I explained how alienated and humiliated I felt in her home and said I couldn't live like this any longer. I informed her that I had arranged to stay with friends and had no intention of returning. Her response was predictable. She yelled, called me ungrateful, and told me to leave immediately. For once, I felt a sense of relief. As I walked out, I realized I wouldn't miss any of them. I wouldn't miss the constant feeling of being an outsider or the indifference that had defined my relationship with my mother for years. But I wasn't content to simply leave. The way my mother had treated me, putting her new family above me, her own daughter, was something I couldn't let go unaddressed. Once I had settled with my friend, I decided to share my story on social media. I recounted the entire ordeal, detailing my mother's unreasonable demand that I share my father's inheritance with her stepchildren and her subsequent ultimatum. I also wrote about the years of neglect and exclusion I had endured, the double standards, and how my mother had chosen to forget about me the moment she built her new family. I included specific instances where I had been made to feel like an outsider in my own home. I knew this post would have consequences. My mother had a significant social media presence, and many of her followers were people who had known my father. I didn't write the post to seek revenge but to tell the truth. People deserved to know the kind of person she was, a woman who would abandon her own daughter's happiness to appease her new husband and his children. The post went viral, and the storm it created was something I had anticipated. While I had walked away from my mother's house with nothing but my dignity and determination, I now felt a sense of justice. I may have lost a family, but I gained clarity about my own strength and self-worth. Life often throws us challenges, but some betrayals leave scars that take time to heal. For most of my life, my mother was my only support system. She was my friend, confidant, and guide. I didn't have a relationship with my grandparents, and with my father gone, she was all I had. So, when she started prioritizing her new family over me, the pain of that betrayal cut deep. I felt abandoned and insignificant, as though I no longer mattered to the one person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. When she chose my step-siblings over me, it wasn't just a decision, it was a statement. It screamed that her new family was more important than her only daughter. The hurt and anger built up inside me until I couldn't hold it anymore. I wanted her to feel even a fraction of the pain I was enduring. So, I made a decision, a drastic one. I wrote a long post on social media, pouring out everything I had held back for years. I recounted the years of neglect, the favoritism, the way my stepfamily treated me like an outsider, and how my mother never cared. I laid bare the details of our last fight, where she demanded that I share my college fund, a fund my late father had set up specifically for me, with my step-siblings. Her ultimatum was cruel and heartless: share the money or be kicked out on my 18th birthday. The post spread quickly. My mother was well known in her social circles, and people were eager for any excuse to gossip. My inbox was flooded with messages, and it didn't take long for her to hear about it. The fallout was immediate and intense. She bombarded me with messages, accusing me of ruining her life. In her eyes, I was the villain, the ungrateful daughter who dared to air family grievances in public. She wrote that she had raised me to be kind and compassionate, and now she couldn't even recognize me as her daughter. Her words stung, but nothing hit harder than when she brought up my late father. She said he would be ashamed of me if he were alive, that he wouldn't even want to be related to me. Her words shattered me. I felt a wave of guilt and doubt. Had I gone too far? Should I have just stayed quiet? I started questioning my decisions, wondering if I was the bad one in all of this. But deep down, I knew better. Her attempts to manipulate me were just another way to control the narrative and avoid accountability. After reading her messages, I blocked her. It was a hard decision, but I needed to protect my mental health. I decided to leave the post up, not out of spite, but because it was the truth. She knew where I was staying. My friend's family had taken me in, but she never once showed genuine concern for me. If she wanted to make things right, she would have apologized. Instead, she demanded I fix her reputation. Weeks later, she finally showed up at my friend's house. She brought my remaining belongings packed in a black garbage bag, a symbolic gesture that showed exactly how she viewed me. She dumped the bag on the floor and stormed in as if she owned the place. My friend's parents were horrified by her behavior. They confronted her, telling her that her actions were cruel and unacceptable. But she dismissed their concerns, calling me a delinquent and ungrateful. The confrontation escalated, and my friend's parents threatened to call the police. My mother left, furious and humiliated, but not before creating another scene. For the first time in years, I felt defended. My friend and her family stood by me, and their kindness brought tears to my eyes. That wasn't the last I heard from her, though. A couple of months later, she returned, more aggressive than ever. This time, she demanded that I delete the post and publicly apologize. She accused me of ruining her life and yelled relentlessly. When I refused, things turned violent. She grabbed my arm and tried to drag me out of the house, screaming for me to fix the damage I'd caused. Thankfully, my friend recorded the entire incident on her phone. Her parents called the police, and my mother was escorted away. The video now lives on my social media, a stark reminder of everything I endured. I could have used it as evidence, but I chose not to. I didn't have the energy to pursue legal action or escalate the drama further. I just wanted peace. Today, I've moved on to a new chapter. I'm attending my dream university, sharing an apartment with a kind and understanding roommate, and building a life free from the toxicity of my past. My mother no longer has access to me, and I've cut ties with her completely. I'm still healing, and while the scars of her betrayal will always remain, I've learned to focus on the people who truly care for me. My journey has been anything but easy, but I'm finally finding peace and rediscovering my worth. The road ahead is mine to carve, and I'm determined to make it one filled with happiness and hope.